Because of the diverse background in the classroom, depending on where our students come from, they may come from within the ASEAN region or they may come from outside of the region. So it is important for them to understand what ASEAN is, who the members are, what our emblem is, and also the famous ASEAN handshake. Because ASEAN law and policy is impacted by external factors, it is important to highlight to students that law institutions, state interests, power, geopolitics, internal and external pressures always bring to bear upon ASEAN and its member states, and these factors shape how the 10 member states cooperate and integrate. It is important to let our students know what to expect from the course, because this is a tertiary level course. I emphasize concepts and scholarly studies, literature from experts, but also since we are equipping the new generation of ASEAN law and policy experts, students also expect to be trained up in more practical skills. And so in my course, they get training to be a good lawyer, adept in ASEAN law, and because ASEAN law and policy is a subset of public international law, they will also get the general skills in international law so that they can go out to work in future in both the public and private sectors. For those who are especially interested in ASEAN law and policy, I introduce them to the CIL-NUS Annual ASEAN Law Academy that trains practitioners, policymakers, and academics in higher level postgraduate courses such as trade and investment, economics, and public policy. For the time being, in the classroom, my students learn how to spot legal issues or problems with which they can use law to solve. They will also know how to write substantive legal arguments concisely yet comprehensively. And because ASEAN is a fast-changing region, even with the skills that we have, we cannot expect these skills to be applied uniformly to every problem. So in my classroom, I demand and I also train up intellectual dexterity, that with the toolbox of skills that we learn and are equipped with, we can use them to solve problems A, problems B, problem C, a diverse range of problems. So the students emerge from the classroom better and better in creative yet logical problem solving. And this is really very important for ASEAN law and policy. I emphasize this many times in my class. I think it's very important to let the students know that in order to excel in ASEAN law and policy, however way you want to construct such an undergraduate course, is for the students to know that they need to discard all preconceived notions of ASEAN. And what do I mean by this? When they read the newspapers, there are many political observers who say that ASEAN is a talk shop, ASEAN doesn't do anything substantive, ASEAN has very little impact in the real world. But then the real question is, if ASEAN is not as important as these observers say, then why are they still working on it? Why are they still observing it? Why are they still interested in it? And for those in the classroom, if they think ASEAN is not important, then why are they still signing up to this class? So it is important to get rid of all the stereotypes about ASEAN and retain only the fundamental interest in ASEAN. In this new world of ASEAN law and policy, we are seeing ASEAN becoming stronger, becoming more relevant in the world, and we are more relevant to ourselves within the region as well. Because the readings can be quite complex and difficult, I encourage my students to read carefully. I curate the number of pages of reading to 30 per classroom hour. And so because this is run seminar style of 3 hours, there will be a maximum of 90 pages of reading per seminar. And because this is an international law course that also has great influence from politics and diplomacy, students should come prepared to class to participate. There is no one right answer that emanates from the teacher. Everyone should come to class having read the material, and they need to listen to one another when they give answers or suggest answers or pronounce legal arguments. They need to listen to one another, refine each other's arguments, and discuss actively. Because this ASEAN law and policy class has some international law influences, I let the students without a public international law background know that this is a basic class on ASEAN law and policy. Those without an international law background will not be undermined because the course is designed to level the playing field. And in all the years that I've taught this undergraduate and postgraduate class, nobody has been shortchanged and everyone has done fairly well. Because of this year's pandemic, all classes will be held virtually, and so the seminar style is modified slightly. I will give a short video lecture for about 20 minutes, which students can view at their own time. And there will be the usual seminar reading list with a list of questions that will aid them in understanding the reading and aid them in understanding what ASEAN law and policy is about. So the reading they will take at their own pace, but the questions should be timed to be answered in about 30 minutes. And thereafter, we will have a Zoom classroom discussion every week of about 1.5 hours max. So all in all, A, B, and C will add up to about 3 hours in the classroom. In terms of assessment for ASEAN law and policy as a tertiary level course, class participation has quite high grades of 20%. And then there will be a midterm essay to assess their understanding and skills that they have learned so far, graded at about 30%. And the final end of term exam is worth 50%. So they will answer about 2 essays of about 2,000 to 2,500 words each. And this will be a take-home exam of 6 hours. So usually it starts at 9 in the morning with the submission deadline at 3 p.m. in the afternoon. How the entire course runs is as follows. So there is part 1 where we introduce the general concepts. And the main topic of week 1 is ASEAN, the political creature in its first 40 years, from the time of its establishment up to the adoption of the ASEAN Charter. And week 2, we focus on ASEAN, the legal creature, where it takes on, after the adoption of the Charter, legal personality and explicit and express legal characteristics. In part 2, which runs from weeks 3 to week 5, we look at the rule of law and institutions in ASEAN. There is the rule of law in ASEAN and the making of ASEAN instruments. And then in week 4, we look at how these laws are being practiced and used by the institutions of ASEAN and the ASEAN member states. So we look at regional governance at multiple levels, how intergovernmentalism works in ASEAN. And in week 5, we want the rule of law and institutions to work efficiently and effectively in the region. So we look at how we can secure compliance with ASEAN law and institutions. There is an optional week of seminar where we look at ASEAN law and national regimes, but this is not going to be offered this year. In part 3, with all the skills that we have learned in part 1 and part 2, we look at the application upon ASEAN law, the substantive law of ASEAN. So in weeks 6 and 7, we look at the first and the third pillar, ASEAN and security, and the socio-cultural pillars. And in week 7, there is another focus on the political and socio-cultural pillars. So topics that we cover pertain to human rights, the haze, maritime delimitation, territorial disputes. In weeks 8 and 9, we focus on the second pillar, the ASEAN Economic Community. So we look at the history of ASEAN economic cooperation and transit into the present economic integration that we are intensively carrying out. In the last 2 weeks, we look at how ASEAN engages with the rest of the world. In ASEAN External Relations 1, in week 10, we look at legal personality, centrality, and being in the driver's seat. So how ASEAN engages in non-economic ties with the rest of the world. And in the final week, we look at ASEAN's external trade relations. And this topic is increasingly important because ASEAN, in its integration ambition, wants to be a single market and also plug into the global supply chains. And with this, the students understand what ASEAN law and policy is about and what the journey through weeks 1 to weeks 11 will necessitate. Thank you.